What happens when a sports league realizes its biggest star doesn't actually need it anymore? Not in theory, not emotionally, not symbolically, but financially, contractually, publicly. Because that's the situation unfolding right now. Caitlin Clark, the rookie who flipped ticket sales, shattered viewership records, and forced mainstream sports media to finally pay attention, has reportedly received an official warning from the WNBA regarding her partnership with NBC. Not a congratulations, not a celebration, a warning. Let that sink in. Instead of leaning into the moment, instead of marketing it as proof that one of their players is becoming a national sports voice, instead of using it to elevate the entire league, they allegedly questioned whether her NBC role could be a conflict of interest. And that single phrase may end up defining this entire era of women's basketball. Because this isn't just about television appearances. It isn't just about contracts. It's about control. It's about power. And it's about what happens when a generational star grows faster than the system built to contain her. For years, the WNBA operated within a stable structure. Modest ratings, predictable growth, loyal core fans, a tight ecosystem. Then Caitlin Clark arrived. And suddenly, everything accelerated. A rookie became the headline. A five-figure salary player became the center of billion-dollar conversations. A league used to flying under the radar was suddenly trending every single week. That kind of growth changes relationships. Because when the spotlight gets that bright, the question shifts from how do we survive to who controls this? And that's where this story really begins. But before we even get to the NBC deal, before we get to the alleged warning, before we talk about locker room whispers or executive pressure, we need to talk about one number that explains everything. And it's a number most people casually scroll past without realizing what it actually means. Let's start with the uncomfortable math. Caitlin Clark's rookie salary is roughly in the $70,000 range. In the world of professional sports, that isn't even mid-tier. It isn't star level. It isn't franchise player money. It's entry level. That number matters more than people think. Because while Clark is selling out arenas, moving merchandise at record pace, and driving television ratings that the league hasn't seen in years, her base league paycheck doesn't reflect that impact. Now compare that to her endorsement deals, 8-figure partnerships, national campaigns, shoe contracts, and now a major NBC role covering basketball at the highest level, including Olympic and NBA coverage. The financial gap isn't small. It's massive. And here's where the tension starts to form. When your side opportunity pays exponentially more than your primary employer, the power dynamic shifts. Quietly at first, then all at once. For decades, leagues held leverage because they controlled access. They controlled exposure. They controlled relevance. But in the nil era, in the creator economy, in the age of personal brands and social media dominance, the athlete can become bigger than the platform. And when that happens, the old model starts to shake. Caitlin Clark isn't just an employee clocking in for games. She's a brand. She's a ratings driver. She's appointment television. And here's the part that makes executives uncomfortable. The numbers prove it. When she plays, viewership spikes. When she travels, road attendance jumps. When she's featured, engagement explodes. That's not opinion. That's measurable. So now imagine being a league office watching your rookie, your lowest paid tier contract player, command more national attention than the institution itself. It creates an imbalance. And imbalances create fear. Because if the player doesn't financially depend on the league the way previous generations did, then the league loses its biggest piece of leverage. Think about it. In older sports structures, players needed the league contract. That was the main source of income. The endorsement deals came after. Now, for select generational stars, endorsements come first. Media deals come first. Personal brand comes first. The league becomes one piece of the ecosystem, not the center of it. And that shift changes negotiations, behavior, and authority. If Clark earns multiples of her league salary through NBC, what real financial threat does a warning carry? A fine? A suspension? The risk calculation is different when the athlete's economic security isn't tied exclusively to the league's payroll. And that's why this moment feels bigger than a standard compliance issue. It feels like a stress test, not just for Clark, but for the WNBA's entire business model. Because if one rookie can generate this level of outside leverage, what happens when the next one arrives? What happens when future stars enter the league already built as global brands? Does the league adapt? Or does it tighten control? That's the Crossroads. And the NBC deal wasn't just a contract. It was a signal. A signal that Clark's influence extends beyond the hardwood. A signal that she isn't confined to one logo. A signal that her career trajectory may not follow the traditional path. And if you're in the league office, watching that unfold in real time, you're faced with a decision. Do you embrace it, or do you try to regulate it? Because the warning, whether procedural or symbolic, sends a message. It says, we still control the structure. But in modern sports economics, control doesn't come from paperwork. It comes from audience loyalty. It comes from cultural relevance. And that's where things start to get complicated. Because if the fans are tuning in primarily for one player, if sponsors are aligning primarily with one personality, if networks are building programming around one name, then the leverage isn't sitting in the commissioner's office. It's sitting with the star. And that reality may be the most disruptive part of this entire situation. But money alone doesn't explain the full story. Because if this were just about salary gaps, it would be a quiet negotiation. This feels louder. This feels personal. And once you look past the financial imbalance, you start to see the deeper conflict emerging. And it's not just about contracts. It's about visibility. It's about influence. And it's about whether promoting the NBA through NBC somehow threatens the WNBA's identity. That's where the conflict of interest argument enters the chat. And that's where this story escalates. Now let's talk about the phrase that changed everything. Conflict of interest. It sounds professional. It sounds neutral. It sounds like something pulled straight out of a legal handbook. But when you strip it down, what does it actually mean in this situation? The concern, reportedly, is that Caitlin Clark's partnership with NBC, a network that broadcasts the NBA and the Olympics, could dilute her commitment to the WNBA. Pause there, because this is where things start to feel complicated. NBC isn't just airing basketball. They're one of the most powerful media companies in sports broadcasting. They control narratives. They build stars. They package moments into cultural events. And now they've attached Caitlin Clark to that machine. From the league's perspective, you can understand the surface-level anxiety. If your biggest star is appearing on national broadcasts discussing NBA storylines, promoting Olympic coverage, expanding her presence beyond the WNBA ecosystem, does that shift where her loyalty lies? Does it blur brand alignment? Does it make her bigger than the Shield? Those are the types of questions executives quietly ask behind closed doors. But here's the counterargument that fans immediately latch onto. How does promoting basketball hurt basketball? If Clark appears during an Olympic segment and casually references her WNBA season, that's free advertising. If she interviews an NBA star and millions of viewers tune in, viewers who may not normally watch WNBA games, that's expanded reach. Visibility is currency in modern sports, and she brings visibility everywhere she goes. So the idea that exposure could somehow weaken the league feels fragile. Unless the real fear isn't about exposure. Unless the real fear is about control of the narrative. Because when a player becomes a broadcaster, something changes. They gain a voice outside the team structure. They gain influence beyond post-game press conferences. They gain access to conversations that typically exclude active players. And that independence can be powerful. Historically, leagues prefer centralized messaging, press releases, media days, approved interviews, controlled environments. But NBC isn't a controlled environment owned by the league. It's an entirely separate platform, one with global reach, one that doesn't answer to WNBA executives. That shift matters, because once a player has a national media microphone, their influence isn't filtered the same way. They aren't just responding to questions. They're shaping discussions. And for a league still solidifying its identity in the mainstream, that unpredictability can feel risky. But here's where it gets even more interesting. There's very little precedent for this exact situation in the WNBA. You don't typically see active players taking on major national broadcasting roles tied to networks that also partner with the NBA and Olympic coverage. This is new territory. And when organizations enter new territory, they either evolve or they tighten the rules. So the warning, whether it was procedural, precautionary, or aggressive, may represent uncertainty more than hostility. But perception matters. And publicly, it doesn't look like cautious governance. It looks like pushback. It looks like resistance. It looks like a league uncomfortable with how fast one player's platform is expanding. And perception drives fan reaction. The moment the phrase "official warning" started circulating, the narrative exploded. Fans weren't dissecting contract clauses. They were asking one question: why would you threaten the player driving your growth? That emotional reaction spreads faster than legal nuance. And in modern sports culture, optics often outweigh technicalities. Now consider this. If Clark were earning $20 million per year from her WNBA contract, the league would likely have significantly more authority to dictate her outside obligations. That's standard in many professional sports structures. But when the primary contract is modest and the external deals are massive, the balance of power shifts. It becomes harder to frame outside opportunities as distractions. Instead, they look like smart career moves. And that's where the conflict narrative starts to feel shaky. Because the real world doesn't operate on brand purity anymore. Athletes are multi-platform figures. They host podcasts. They invest in companies. They collaborate with networks. They become content creators. The line between player and personality has blurred. Caitlin Clark isn't just a shooting guard. She's a content driver. And networks want that. But leagues historically move slower than culture. And when culture accelerates faster than governance structures, tension builds. That tension is what we're seeing now. Not necessarily a villain. Not necessarily a hero, but a system trying to figure out how to handle a star who doesn't fit the old mold. Still, there's another layer to this. Because executives don't operate in isolation. They hear from stakeholders. They hear from team owners. They hear from veteran players. They hear from union leadership. And if enough voices raise concerns about fairness, focus, or precedent, pressure forms, and pressure influences decisions. Which leads us to the whispers that make this story even more volatile. Because some insiders believe this wasn't just about contracts or network affiliations. They believe it started somewhere else entirely. Somewhere inside the locker room. And once you explore that possibility, the entire narrative shifts. Here's where the story stops being about paperwork and starts being about people. Because leagues don't operate in a vacuum. They respond to pressure. And sometimes that pressure doesn't come from sponsors or networks or legal departments. Sometimes it comes from inside the building. For months now, there's been a quiet undercurrent in the WNBA. A tension that isn't always visible in post-game interviews, but shows up in body language, in comments, in subtle reactions. Veterans who've been grinding for a decade. Players who played overseas in the off-season just to supplement income. Athletes who built the league brick by brick when ratings were modest and arenas were half full. And then suddenly, a 22-year-old rookie enters the league and the entire spotlight shifts. Not gradually. Instantly. The camera angles change. The scheduling changes. The national media narrative changes. And with it, so does the hierarchy. Now, to be clear, competitiveness is normal. Pride is normal. Professional jealousy exists in every industry. But this situation isn't normal. This is economic whiplash. You go from earning modest league recognition for years to watching a newcomer land 8-figure endorsements before playing a single professional minute. You see charter flight discussions accelerate. You see television contracts renegotiated. You see sponsors suddenly energized. And it all seems to orbit one name. That creates friction. Even if nobody says it publicly. Even if everyone smiles for the cameras. Professional sports locker rooms are ecosystems built on hierarchy, respect, and tenure. And when the financial ecosystem shifts faster than the cultural one, tension builds. Now layer this on top. Clark isn't just popular. She's commercially dominant. When her games are broadcast, ratings spike. When she travels, arenas sell out. When she's featured, merchandise numbers surge. That doesn't just impact fans. It impacts revenue-sharing conversations. It impacts CBA discussions. It impacts bargaining leverage. And if you're a veteran player who has been advocating for higher salaries for years, seeing the league suddenly flush with attention tied to one rookie can be complicated emotionally. Not necessarily hatred, not necessarily resentment, but complicated. Now imagine those emotions entering union meetings. Imagine discussions about fairness, about workload, about marketing distribution, about whether one player is receiving preferential treatment. These are real conversations that happen in professional sports. and when enough voices question the optics of a player taking on major outside media roles, league executives listen. Because the last thing a commissioner wants is internal division. The last thing leadership wants is public perception that one player operates under a different rulebook. So what happens? Sometimes, action is taken not to attack the star, but to maintain equilibrium, to send a signal internally that no one is above the structure. And that's where the warning narrative becomes layered. Was it purely about contract compliance? Or was it partially about optics inside the locker room? Because from a leadership standpoint, maintaining locker room unity is critical. But here's the paradox. Trying to level the field in a star-driven league can backfire. Because fans don't see union dynamics. They don't see internal debates. They see outcomes. And when the outcome appears to restrict the player driving growth, public sympathy shifts fast. And that's dangerous territory. Now consider the psychological side of this. Caitlin Clark didn't enter the league quietly. She arrived with national attention. She arrived with expectations. She arrived with a built-in audience. That kind of spotlight can unintentionally overshadow established stars. And even if veterans intellectually understand that growth benefits everyone, emotionally, it can still feel destabilizing. Professional sports aren't just about skill. They're about identity, about legacy, about recognition. And when the conversation pivots entirely toward one name, it can feel like erasure to those who built the foundation. So pressure builds. Questions get asked. Concerns get raised. And leadership feels compelled to act. Not necessarily because they want to suppress a star, but because they're trying to manage a rapidly shifting ecosystem. Still, here's where things get complicated. Modern fans don't respond well to perceived containment of talent. They don't want balance. They want greatness amplified. They don't want equilibrium. They want acceleration. And that difference in priorities between internal stability and external hype creates a fault line. One side prioritizes structure. The other prioritizes momentum. And right now, those forces appear to be colliding. But the locker room theory alone doesn't explain the full scale of reaction we're seeing. Because this isn't just about players. It's about numbers. It's about leverage. It's about what happens when the data becomes impossible to ignore. And once you examine the numbers, the power dynamic starts to look very different. At some point, narratives stop being debates. They become data. And when you look at the numbers surrounding Caitlin Clark's arrival, something becomes very clear. The power structure isn't what it used to be. For years, the WNBA operated within predictable growth patterns. Steady, gradual, respectable, but modest. Then one player enters the league, and television ratings spike to levels not seen in decades. Road games start selling out. Secondary ticket prices climb. Merchandise numbers surge. National media outlets that rarely discuss the WNBA suddenly lead with it. That kind of acceleration isn't cosmetic. It's structural. Because in professional sports, revenue dictates authority. And revenue follows attention. When one player becomes the primary driver of attention, that player's leverage increases, whether executives acknowledge it or not. Think about the timeline. Major media rights negotiations were already in motion. Networks were evaluating growth potential. Sponsors were analyzing engagement metrics. And suddenly, a rookie season starts generating numbers that change the projection models. That matters, because broadcast deals are negotiated based on anticipated future value. If Caitlin Clark's presence materially impacts viewership forecasts, she isn't just a player. She's a financial variable. And financial variables influence boardroom conversations. Now imagine you're sitting in those negotiations. You're presenting growth charts. You're pitching the future of the league. And a disproportionate amount of the upward curve aligns with one name. That shifts leverage. Because investors and networks start asking quiet questions. What happens if that player leaves? What happens if that player is restricted? What happens if that player feels undervalued? Those are uncomfortable questions for any league. No organization wants to appear dependent on a single individual. But star-driven leagues have always existed. The NBA had Michael Jordan. The PGA had Tiger Woods. The UFC had Conor McGregor. When stars transcend the sport, they alter the business model. And the WNBA may be experiencing its first true version of that phenomenon at this scale. The difference? This transformation is happening in the modern digital era, where social media amplifies every perceived slight. Every rumor spreads instantly. Every warning becomes a headline. So now the power dynamic isn't just financial. It's cultural. If fans tune in primarily for Clark, if sponsors align campaigns around Clark, if networks build promotional packages around Clark, then disciplining Clark, even in minor ways, carries disproportionate risk. Because public sentiment follows the star. And public sentiment drives sponsor confidence, which drives revenue stability. This is the ecosystem. It's interconnected. Now here's the strategic dilemma the league faces. If they ignore internal rules for one player, they risk locker room resentment. If they enforce rules rigidly, they risk public backlash. Either path carries consequences. But the scale of consequence is different. Internal tension can often be managed quietly. Public consumer revolt? That's harder to contain. Because fans vote with viewership. They vote with ticket purchases. They vote with subscription cancellations. And in today's sports economy, digital backlash can escalate faster than executive meetings can respond. Now layer in the sponsorship dimension. Major brands don't just invest in leagues. They invest in personalities. Nike didn't sign a logo. They signed Caitlin Clark. State Farm didn't align with abstract policy. They aligned with a face. If conflict escalates publicly between the league and its biggest commercial asset, sponsors pay attention. They don't want instability. They don't want controversy overshadowing campaigns. They want growth. And growth right now appears closely tied to one individual's visibility. That creates silent leverage. The kind that isn't written into contracts, but influences decisions behind closed doors. This is where the phrase "bigger than the league" starts circulating online. Now, emotionally, that phrase can trigger defensiveness. No league wants to admit dependency. But in measurable business terms, dependency can happen unintentionally, especially during transitional growth phases. And this may be one of those phases. The WNBA is expanding. Media money is increasing. National exposure is rising. But expansion periods are fragile. They require momentum. They require positive optics. They require unity. A public dispute with your primary growth driver during that window? That's volatile. And volatility makes investors nervous. It makes executives cautious. It makes sponsors watch closely. So the question becomes, does the league truly have leverage here? Or does the appearance of enforcement mask an uncomfortable reality? That disciplining Clark could cost more than accommodating her? Because once a star's economic impact outweighs their contractual salary, traditional leverage erodes. And that erosion isn't loud. It's subtle, until a moment like this exposes it. Now, here's where the situation escalates further. Because this isn't just about internal league math. There's another player in this equation, a much larger one, a corporate giant with legal muscle, global reach, and Olympic programming power. And once you factor them into the equation, the scale of this situation changes dramatically. Because now, it's not just league versus player. It's potentially league versus network. And that's a very different fight. This is the part people are underestimating. Because this isn't just Caitlin Clark signing a guest analyst role on a small network segment. This is NBC, one of the most powerful broadcasting corporations in the world. A company that owns Olympic rights, NBA rights, primetime national distribution, massive cross-platform marketing infrastructure. And they didn't casually attach Clark to their programming schedule. They made a statement. When a network like NBC invests in a personality, they don't do it lightly. They build campaigns around them. They slot them into future promotional arcs. They align long-term strategy with visibility projections. And Clark isn't being positioned as background talent. She's being positioned as a face. That changes the scale of everything. Because now, if a league attempts to restrict that relationship, even subtly, it isn't just negotiating with a player. It's brushing up against a corporate machine. NBC is owned by Comcast. Comcast operates at a valuation level that dwarfs the WNBA's entire ecosystem. That doesn't automatically mean conflict, but it does mean leverage is asymmetrical. If the WNBA were to escalate this situation beyond a warning, if it ever reached suspension talk or contractual obstruction, the legal complexity would multiply instantly. NBC isn't a passive stakeholder. They have lawyers whose hourly rates exceed some player salaries. They don't sign talent to let external organizations disrupt programming. And timing matters here. The Olympics are approaching. The Los Angeles Games represent one of the largest global sports events in recent memory. NBC's coverage strategy is years in the making. If Clark is part of that long-term arc, if she's being integrated into Olympic storytelling, that relationship isn't something a niche league can casually interfere with. That's where the risk calculus shifts. Because a warning may be procedural, but escalation could become corporate conflict. And corporate conflict rarely favors the smaller entity. Now imagine the optics if this situation escalated publicly. Headlines wouldn't read, routine compliance discussion. They'd read, league challenges NBC over star talent. That's not good PR. That's instability. And instability during a growth phase is dangerous. But beyond legal risk, there's something even more important: perception of ambition. Clark's NBC deal signals that her career trajectory isn't limited to one vertical. She isn't just a player. She's becoming a media personality, a multi-platform presence. And historically, leagues struggle during moments when athletes outgrow traditional lanes. Because it forces adaptation. It forces flexibility. It forces acknowledgement that the old structure may not fully contain the new reality. NBC offering Clark a microphone does something subtle but powerful. It positions her as an authority, not just an athlete, not just a highlight, but a voice that amplifies influence. And influence outside league control is uncomfortable for institutions built on centralized messaging. But here's the paradox. Every time Clark appears on national television discussing basketball, any basketball, it reinforces her association with the sport. And when casual viewers think basketball, they think of the biggest current names, which increasingly includes her. So restricting that exposure doesn't shrink her platform. It risks shrinking the league's alignment with it. Because if fans associate Clark with NBC, the NBA, and Olympic coverage, and the WNBA appears to resist that evolution, the brand perception gap widens, and perception drives long-term loyalty. This is where strategy becomes critical. Does the league collaborate with NBC to maximize crossover promotion? Or does it protect boundaries at the expense of momentum? Because momentum is fragile, and Clark's rise has created rare momentum. The kind leagues spend decades chasing. The kind executives dream about during media rights negotiations. And yet, moments like this create friction during what should be acceleration. But here's what truly makes this volatile. NBC doesn't need the WNBA to succeed. The WNBA benefits from NBC exposure far more than the reverse. That asymmetry matters. Because in business disputes, leverage often comes down to dependency. Who needs who more? Clark's individual brand appears stable regardless of league tension. NBC's programming pipeline is robust regardless of one league's internal policy. But the WNBA's current growth narrative? It is closely tied to Clark's visibility. That's the imbalance. And if executives miscalculate that imbalance, consequences can ripple quickly. Still, there's a scenario even more dramatic than corporate friction. A scenario fans are already debating online. What happens if the league actually pushes this too far? What if a warning becomes enforcement? What if enforcement becomes suspension? That's where the temperature truly spikes. Because then it stops being speculation. It becomes confrontation. And confrontation in the modern digital sports era rarely ends quietly. Let's run the scenario all the way through. Not halfway. Not cautiously. All the way. Imagine the headline drops tomorrow morning. WNBA suspends Caitlin Clark over NBC conflict. Just imagine it. Within minutes, social media explodes. Not slow outrage. Instant eruption. Because this wouldn't feel like rule enforcement. It would feel like retaliation. And in the current climate of sports fandom, perception matters more than nuance. Fans don't read compliance clauses. They react to emotion. And the emotional reaction would be swift. The first wave would be disbelief. The second wave would be anger. The third wave would be mobilization. Because modern sports fans don't just complain anymore. They coordinate. They trend hashtags. They cancel subscriptions. They flood sponsor comment sections. They create viral narratives that spread faster than official statements. And the league would find itself not in a controlled PR cycle, but in a digital wildfire. Now think about sponsors. Major brands are hypersensitive to controversy. They don't want instability attached to their marketing spend. They especially don't want to be seen as backing an organization perceived as suppressing its most popular athlete. If outrage trends for days, if media personalities outside the league start weighing in, if the situation spills into mainstream news cycles, Sponsors start asking internal questions. Is this sustainable? Is this damaging brand alignment? Should we distance ourselves? And that's where financial consequences begin to surface. Not because of a rule violation, but because of public optics. Now here's the strategic disaster scenario. Suspending Clark doesn't silence her. It amplifies her. It transforms her from star to symbol. And symbols are powerful. Suddenly, she isn't just a player navigating contract language. She becomes the face of athlete empowerment versus institutional control. That narrative spreads easily. It's clean. It's emotional. It's viral. And once a player becomes a martyr figure, even temporarily, the balance of power shifts dramatically. Because fans rally around perceived injustice. Even neutral observers get pulled in. Now add another layer. Clark doesn't financially depend solely on league salary. So suspension doesn't carry the same leverage it might have carried decades ago. If she's still appearing on NBC, still fulfilling endorsement contracts, still maintaining visibility, then the punitive impact is symbolic more than economic. And symbolic punishment often backfires in the social media era. Because the story becomes, the league punished its biggest star. Not, the league enforced policy. That difference is critical. Now imagine the follow-up effects. Attendance dips during suspension. Viewership numbers drop. National media discussions focus on controversy instead of basketball. Instead of celebrating growth, headlines question leadership. Instead of momentum, there's distraction. All during a period when the league is trying to solidify long-term expansion. That's high risk. And here's the part executives quietly calculate. If suspension sparks measurable revenue decline, even short-term, it validates the perception that Clark drives disproportionate value, which strengthens her leverage upon return. So enforcement could paradoxically increase her influence. That's the irony. Now let's zoom out even further. In modern sports, fans don't just follow teams. They follow personalities. Player loyalty often outweighs logo loyalty. If a fan primarily tunes in to watch Clark, and she's removed from the product, some fans don't just wait patiently. They disengage. They redirect attention elsewhere. And rebuilding that momentum isn't automatic. Attention is fragile. It's easier to capture than to regain. Now consider broadcast partners. If viewership dips during controversy, networks take notice. Future negotiations factor in volatility risk. And volatility weakens leverage during media rights conversations. All from one enforcement decision. That's why this scenario feels so combustible. Because the league isn't disciplining a mid-tier rotation player. They'd be disciplining their current visibility engine. And that's rare territory. But here's the twist. Sometimes organizations issue warnings not because they intend to escalate, but because they're testing reaction, testing boundaries, testing leverage, seeing how far they can push before backlash materializes. If that's the case here, then this moment is less about suspension and more about power signaling. But signals can misfire. And once public sentiment hardens, reversing narrative becomes difficult. Now here's an uncomfortable truth. The league doesn't want to fight Clark. Clark doesn't need to fight the league. But if confrontation escalates, only one side risks existential damage. Clark's brand appears portable. The league's brand is centralized. And centralized brands are more vulnerable to mass backlash. That imbalance makes this scenario extremely delicate. But here's the deeper layer nobody is talking about loudly yet. The biggest long-term consequence wouldn't be this season. It would be the message sent to the next generation. And that might be even more dangerous than a suspension headline. Here's the part league executives can't afford to ignore. This isn't happening in isolation. There's an entire generation of elite talent watching how this plays out. Paige Buchers, Juju Watkins, Hannah Hidalgo, future #1 picks still in high school. Nil-era superstars already earning 7 figures before stepping onto a professional court. These athletes grew up in a completely different economic environment. They don't see themselves as just players. They see themselves as brands. They've built audiences before they've signed contracts. They've negotiated endorsements before they've negotiated rookie deals. They understand leverage at 19 years old. That's new. A decade ago, the WNBA held structural authority because the league was the main gateway to income and exposure. Now, top prospects may already have national followings before draft night. They may already have podcast deals, streaming partnerships, major shoe contracts, media training. direct fan engagement platforms. So when they look at how the league treats its biggest current star, they aren't just observing drama. They're evaluating risk. They're asking quiet questions. If I build my platform independently, will I be restricted? If I land a major media role, will I face pushback? If I become bigger than the system expects, will the system resist me? Those questions matter. Because generational talents don't just choose based on tradition. They choose based on opportunity. And opportunity now includes flexibility. Now imagine being Paige Buchers watching this unfold. You're already a household name. You already understand media attention. You already know endorsement dynamics. And you see a league grappling publicly with how to manage external success. It sends a signal. Not necessarily a hostile one, but a cautionary one. Then imagine Juju Watkins, a player whose college games already generate national buzz. She's growing up in the influencer era. She understands brand equity instinctively, and she sees headlines about conflict over outside visibility. She takes notes, because athletes today think long-term. They think beyond contracts. They think about control of narrative. They think about ownership of identity. And leagues that appear resistant to that evolution risk falling behind culturally. This is where the WNBA stands at a crossroads. The league can position itself as a launch pad, a platform that amplifies star growth across all mediums. Or it can position itself as a gatekeeper, protecting structure even if that slows expansion. The difference matters deeply to incoming talent. Because in the nil era, players no longer rely solely on league approval for exposure. They can monetize independently. They can build communities independently. They can sustain influence independently. So the league's value proposition must evolve. It can't just be this is where you play. It must also be this is where you grow. And growth now includes media roles, brand expansion, cross-platform visibility. If Clark's NBC partnership is framed as conflict, future stars may hesitate before fully committing their identity to one ecosystem. Not because they want to rebel, but because they want freedom. And freedom is currency in modern sports. Now zoom out even further. Women's basketball is in a rare momentum window. College ratings are soaring. Young players are becoming household names before turning pro. Social media engagement is accelerating. The pipeline is stronger than it has ever been. Moments like this either strengthen that pipeline or create doubt within it. If the narrative becomes the league limits its stars, that reputation can linger. Even if the reality is more nuanced. Perception shapes recruitment. Perception shapes trust. And trust determines long-term alignment. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The league isn't wrong to want structure. Every professional organization needs guidelines. Every league must protect contractual integrity. The issue isn't whether rules exist. The issue is whether those rules evolve alongside the culture. And culture has shifted dramatically in the last 5 years. Athletes are no longer confined to one lane. They are entrepreneurs, media personalities, investors, content creators, influencers, advocates, multidimensional public figures. The next generation expects that flexibility to be embraced, not challenged. So this moment isn't just about Clark's NBC role. It's about signaling to the future. Are you allowed to expand freely? Or must expansion be negotiated cautiously? And if the answer leans toward caution, some elite prospects may look at overseas opportunities, at alternative leagues, at hybrid career models, not out of disloyalty, but out of pragmatism. Because elite talent always seeks the environment that maximizes upside. The WNBA is in position to be that environment. But it must navigate moments like this carefully, because momentum is fragile, and generational perception is powerful. Still, there's one final layer that ties all of this together. It's not just money. It's not just locker room dynamics. It's not just corporate leverage. It's not just future prospects. At its core, this might be about something much simpler, something more human, something that has shaped every major sports conflict in history: control. And once you frame it through that lens, the entire situation looks different. At some point, every growing league faces this moment. The moment where structure collides with stardom, where institutional authority collides with individual influence, where the question stops being, what does the contract say? And starts being, who really controls the spotlight? Because that's what this feels like. Control of narrative, control of visibility, control of brand alignment. control of who gets to define the future of the league. For decades, sports leagues operated under a simple hierarchy. The league came first. The logo came first. The shield came first. Players were essential, but replaceable. Even superstars operated within a tightly managed ecosystem. Media appearances were negotiated carefully. Messaging was centralized. Brand expansion was incremental. But the digital era shattered that structure. Now a player can build a global following without league permission. Now visibility doesn't require traditional gatekeepers. Now relevance can be sustained independently. And Caitlin Clark may represent the first true stress test of that shift inside the WNBA. Because she didn't just arrive talented. She arrived with momentum. Momentum that existed before her rookie contract was signed. Momentum that followed her from college arenas to professional stadiums. Momentum that networks recognized instantly. And when NBC stepped in, it wasn't to borrow league authority. It was to borrow hers. That's the subtle shift. In the past, networks elevated leagues. Now, sometimes networks elevate players directly. And that bypass can feel destabilizing. Because if the star becomes the central gravitational force, the league must orbit differently. That doesn't mean the league loses importance. But it does mean control becomes shared. And shared control requires adaptation. Now here's where human nature enters the equation. Institutions are built on consistency. They value predictability. They rely on structure to maintain fairness. When something disrupts that equilibrium, especially something that accelerates faster than expected, the instinct is often to stabilize, to tighten guidelines, to clarify boundaries, to assert authority, not necessarily out of malice, but out of preservation. The problem is preservation can look like resistance, and resistance in a growth phase can look like insecurity, especially when fans are emotionally invested in the star driving momentum. Because fans don't analyze governance philosophy. They analyze impact. They ask simple questions. Is the product better with Clark fully empowered? Or is it better with Clark constrained? That's how audiences process it. Now let's examine the deeper psychological layer. If a league begins to feel overshadowed by its own player, tension naturally forms. Not because success is unwelcome, but because dependency feels risky. No executive wants a single point of failure. No commissioner wants headlines suggesting one athlete defines the league. That perception can undermine institutional authority. But the counterpoint is equally powerful. Leagues grow through stars. Every major sports boom has been fueled by transcendent personalities. Jordan didn't shrink the NBA. He expanded it. Tiger didn't weaken the PGA. He exploded its visibility. Serena didn't limit tennis. She globalized it. In each case, the league had a choice. Protect traditional hierarchy, or ride the wave. And history shows that riding the wave, even when uncomfortable, produces expansion. Now here's the tension unique to this moment. Women's basketball is at an inflection point. It's transitioning from niche growth to mainstream relevance. That transition requires boldness. It requires embracing new models. It requires acknowledging that athlete empowerment isn't a threat, it's a catalyst. But transitions are messy. They challenge legacy thinking. They test flexibility. They force uncomfortable conversations. And Clark's NBC partnership may simply be the first major collision between old structure and new era dynamics. Because this isn't just about her. It's about what the next decade of professional women's basketball looks like. Will it mirror older sports governance models? Or will it evolve into something more fluid, where players are multi-platform brands from day one, where outside media roles are integrated, not questioned, where expansion is collaborative, not territorial? Those decisions aren't theoretical anymore. They're happening in real time. Now here's the part nobody can ignore. Control doesn't disappear. It shifts. And when it shifts, tension is inevitable. The league still controls scheduling, contracts, discipline, and competition structure. Clark controls audience engagement, cultural momentum, and commercial appeal. Both are powerful. But only one side directly influences consumer emotion. And consumer emotion ultimately determines revenue. That's the reality modern sports must accept. You can't legislate loyalty. You can't mandate enthusiasm. You can't find your way into growth. Growth comes from excitement. And excitement right now appears deeply connected to one name. So the real question becomes, is this a power struggle? Or is it a growing pain? Is the league resisting evolution? Or simply navigating unprecedented terrain? Because how leadership responds from here will define perception for years. They can double down on authority, or they can recalibrate and publicly embrace expansion. One path protects short-term structure. The other path fuels long-term momentum, and momentum is rare. Still, there's one final angle we haven't explored: the timing. Because timing in sports business is everything. And when you examine when this warning surfaced, it makes the situation even more delicate. If this situation had happened 3 years ago, it probably wouldn't feel this explosive. If it had happened during a quiet off-season with no momentum building, it might have faded within days. But it didn't. It surfaced at a moment when women's basketball is climbing rapidly. The WNBA just entered a new media era. College basketball ratings are surging. Young stars are becoming national brands before they even turn pro. The Olympics are approaching, and mainstream sports networks are finally giving consistent attention to the women's game. This is supposed to be the acceleration phase, the phase where everything aligns. Instead, headlines shifted from growth to conflict. And that's where timing becomes dangerous, because momentum in sports is fragile. It builds slowly, then compounds quickly, but it can stall just as fast. The NBC announcement should have been a pure celebration moment. WNBA star expands to national platform. Women's basketball reaches new level. League talent now center stage in Olympic coverage. Instead, the narrative pivoted. From celebration to controversy. From expansion to enforcement. From opportunity to warning. That shift matters, because the public rarely separates nuance from narrative. The headline becomes the story, and the story becomes the perception. Now consider the media rights landscape. The WNBA recently secured long-term broadcast commitments. Those deals are built on projected growth, projected viewership, projected cultural relevance, and projections rely heavily on momentum trends. If growth appears unstable, if headlines suggest internal friction with the league's most visible star, it introduces uncertainty, even if the conflict never escalates. Uncertainty alone can cool enthusiasm. Now layer in the Olympic factor. The Olympics represent the largest global sports platform available. If Clark is positioned as a prominent voice during that event, it creates crossover potential. Casual Olympic viewers could transition into WNBA viewers. That's priceless marketing. But public controversy during that build-up risks overshadowing the synergy. Instead of WNBA star shines on global stage, the narrative risks becoming league tension shadows Olympic spotlight. That's not ideal, because in sports business, synergy multiplies growth. Conflict divides attention, and attention divided rarely expands at the same speed. Now zoom in further. Off-season periods are supposed to be narrative-building windows. Time to shape storylines. Time to amplify stars. Time to solidify fan excitement for the upcoming season. Instead, this moment introduced doubt. It forced fans into debate mode. It pulled energy away from pure basketball anticipation. And once energy shifts into controversy cycles, it's difficult to redirect immediately. Now here's the strategic dilemma. If the league intended the warning as routine compliance clarification, the optics still misfired. Because issuing that signal during a high-visibility expansion phase invites scrutiny. It feels reactive rather than collaborative. And in modern media environments, reactive organizations often lose narrative control. Because once the story is framed as league versus star, that framing spreads quickly, even if the internal reasoning was more mundane. Timing also influences emotional intensity. Fans are more protective during growth phases. They sense momentum. They don't want disruption. So when disruption appears, even minor, it triggers amplified reaction. It feels like someone tapping the brakes during acceleration. And fans hate that, especially when they've waited years for mainstream recognition. Now consider another layer. This isn't just a league building from modest footing. This is a league finally gaining consistent national conversation. That's rare. That's valuable. And anything that risks destabilizing that conversation becomes magnified. If this warning had occurred quietly without leaks, it might have been absorbed internally. But once it entered public discourse, it became symbolic. Symbolic of friction. Symbolic of tension between institution and individual. Symbolic of a league still wrestling with how to manage star power. And symbols during growth windows can either reinforce strength or expose vulnerability. That's why timing feels so critical here. Because the league didn't just issue a warning. It did so during a moment when unity messaging would have amplified progress. Instead, it introduced division headlines, even if temporary, even if exaggerated. In high-growth environments, perception gaps widen quickly, and repairing perception takes longer than preventing it. Now here's the bigger concern. If this moment becomes a case study in how the league handles star expansion, it could shape narrative memory. People may not remember the technicalities. They'll remember the feeling, and feelings linger longer than clauses. So the question becomes, was this a miscalculated communication strategy? Or was it an intentional boundary-setting moment regardless of optics? Either way, the timing ensured maximum visibility. And maximum visibility means maximum consequence. Because once something enters the public sports discourse at this level, it doesn't disappear quietly. It becomes part of the era's storyline. And this era is still being defined. Which brings us to the final, unavoidable question. Where does this go from here? Because moments like this don't just fade. They resolve, one way or another. And the resolution will determine whether this was a minor growing pain or a turning point in the power balance of women's professional basketball. Every league has a moment that quietly defines its future. Not necessarily a championship, not necessarily a scandal, but a crossroads, a decision point that reveals whether leadership adapts or resists. This feels like one of those moments, because underneath the headlines, underneath the speculation, underneath the warning itself, there's a deeper reality unfolding. Women's basketball is changing. The economics are changing. The athlete power structure is changing. The media landscape is changing. And Caitlin Clark just happens to be standing at the center of that shift. This isn't really about NBC. It isn't really about one clause in a contract. It isn't even really about internal league politics. It's about evolution. For decades, leagues controlled access. Now stars generate access. For decades, visibility flowed through institutions. Now visibility often flows through individuals. For decades, authority meant control. Now authority increasingly means collaboration. And that transition can feel uncomfortable. Because collaboration requires letting go of absolute grip. It requires trusting that empowering your brightest star won't diminish the league, but expand it. The question facing the WNBA right now is simple. Do you treat a generational star like a risk to manage, or like an asset to unleash? Because history tends to reward leagues that lean into momentum. Momentum is rare. Momentum is unpredictable. Momentum cannot be manufactured on command. And right now the league has it. But momentum thrives in oxygen. It doesn't thrive in restriction. If leadership recalibrates, if they publicly embrace Clark's expansion as an extension of league growth, this moment fades into footnote territory. A minor growing pain during a transformational era. But if tension escalates, if enforcement replaces flexibility, if perception hardens around institutional insecurity, then this moment becomes something else. It becomes the story people reference years from now. The moment the league showed its hand. And here's the part nobody wants to admit openly. Fans aren't neutral in this. Fans have already picked sides emotionally. Because fans follow energy. They follow inspiration. They follow momentum. Right now, that energy is attached to a player who represents expansion. And if the league appears to stand in opposition to expansion, it risks misreading its own audience. That doesn't mean rules don't matter. It doesn't mean contracts don't matter. But the way rules are applied during growth phases determines whether they protect the future or slow it. This is bigger than one season, bigger than one warning, bigger than one endorsement deal. It's about what kind of league the WNBA wants to become. A league that protects hierarchy, or a league that accelerates transformation. Because the next generation is watching. Sponsors are watching. Networks are watching. And most importantly, fans are watching. The spotlight is brighter than it has ever been. And how leadership moves under that spotlight will shape the next decade. So now the question shifts to you. If this situation escalates, where do you stand? Is this about necessary structure or unnecessary resistance? Should the league draw hard lines or lean into the moment? Because moments like this define eras. And this era is just getting started. If you want coverage that actually breaks down what's happening behind the headlines, not just the surface noise, make sure you subscribe. We're tracking every development, every ripple effect, and every shift in power as this story unfolds. Because this isn't just basketball anymore. This is business. This is culture. And this might be the turning point that changes women's sports forever. Subscribe now, because the next move in this story could happen fast. And when it does, you'll want to understand what it really means.